California median home prices have reached a record high. And when housing is this expensive, it has dramatic consequences for the average Californian because one, we've traditionally wanted to see that the cost of your housing shouldn't be anywhere beyond 25 to maybe 30% of your income. But in California, that's not the case. People can't come anywhere near that percentage. And then, of course, when you have to put that much money into housing, to the extent that you're able to and find a house that you can afford when the median price is at $900,000, but when you can even get in, it means you don't have money for other things. You don't have discretionary income. You don't have money to buy groceries, maybe. And then investments. You want to invest in other sectors of the economy. So housing can affect all the rest of the economy and certainly affects Americans and Californians' quality of life. When we look back at the last 70 years of America, California was considered the land everyone wanted to go to in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and it was easy to build. What has made California different such that years ago it was affordable to live in California and now it's becoming less and less affordable? Well, the answer to that question is complicated, but at the end of the day, our elected officials in California for decades were thinking they were doing short-term good and certainly getting themselves reelected by restricting the ability to build, prevent density, if you will, or create these large lots that make where you have a significant lot size and that you can't build unless the lot is very large. The government has made it so hard to build housing, to build apartments, to build homes. It's so expensive, so much red tape, rules and the rest, that it becomes difficult to build, which means we don't have the supply that we need to meet the demand. What do I mean when I say the government has gotten in the way? The government has gotten in the way in the sense that, one, at the federal level and at the state level, environmental regulations that are well-intended, don't get me wrong, they're well-meaning, but they really don't achieve the environmental protection goals that they're intended to achieve. And instead, what they actually do, the secondary effect and the unintended consequence is that it becomes very expensive for developers and builders to afford to build because they have to jump through a lot of hoops with, say, the California Coastal Commission or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the DEP, any sort of agency that has to deal with water regulation. It becomes very difficult to just simply jump through those hoops. And that costs time and money. What the government does so often is they put what lawyers call exactions. I'll just simply call them fees. They say if a developer or builder, you want to build, you've got to pay a fee. Maybe you have to pay a road impact fee or a school impact fee, or maybe you have to pay an affordable housing fee. Well, if that road impact is consistent with the amount of impact you're going to have, well, then maybe that's a reasonable fee. But too often, the fee is not in any way proportional to the impact you're going to have. And if it's, say, an affordable housing fee, well, all that's doing is increasing the cost of your house, meaning you have to pay money so the government can give it to someone else for their house. And that doesn't help anybody. That it may in the short term seem like it helps somebody, but in the long term, all it does is increase the cost of housing. So we need to eliminate what we call unconstitutional exactions or fees that are just way out of whack based on what they actually are supposed to achieve and address. The fee, if it's addressing, as I said, the road impact and it's actually reasonable and connected to the impact, sure. But too often it's not. What the government does is it inflates these fees way out of proportion to the actual impact because they can't raise taxes or they're not allowed to raise taxes. So they have to get the money somewhere to fund the ever-growing government, and they use those fees. Also, what the government can do is eliminate or strongly reduce discretion in permit approvals. If you apply for a permit to build on your property and it's reasonable, it should not be discretionary. There shouldn't be neighbors who can come in and tell the local government to veto. You should have the right to build as a matter of right. Similarly, the process to apply for permits should be streamlined. It should be made much easier to apply for a permit. There, for example, there can be models of the government says these are the things we will allow, sight unseen, that if you say you're going to do this, then boom, you get approved. So there's no discretion in it. And then you have the state zoning and local zoning rules and state land regulation rules. The state has made efforts in the last few years to make it a little easier to build, to force the local governments to allow certain kinds of housing, like what we call accessory development units, ADUs. You might call them granny flats. The idea that there could be an adjacent second living quarters to the main house on a piece of property. But those efforts are few and far between. They don't go far enough. Again, we are seeing hints of it. I want to applaud to the extent that Governor Newsom and the California legislature have taken steps to increase the supply of housing and to make it easier to build housing. They should be applauded. But we need more of that. The country does too. If you look across the country, you'll see certain states are taking good steps to make it easier to build housing, which leads to cheaper housing. Montana is a great example. They're very worried in Montana that their real estate market is going to go the way Californians did because so many Californians moved to Montana. And so the governor there took steps to try and alleviate that and make it easier to build housing. I would say that when it comes to government mandates, we want less mandates. Too often, inclusionary zoning is what we call it. The government mandates that you have to have a certain amount of affordable housing a developer does when they build a number of lots. Some of them have to be set aside, if you will, for lower income people. But that doesn't work because all that does is force the other housing that's not set aside for lower income people to be more expensive. And so the people in the middle, sort of the missing middle, sometimes you see that phrase, they end up looking at extravagant home prices because they're not considered low income, yet they are shouldering the burden of the cost for those lower houses that cost money to build. And since the government says builder or developer, you can't impose that cost on that lower income person. So then they have to impose it somewhere or else it just won't be affordable for them to build at all. So when it comes to government mandates, we need the government to get out of the way. As for density issues and communities saying they don't want densities, density increases the amount of housing available. And when we, add to the supply, that addresses that high demand and it brings down the cost of housing. So although I understand that people worry about density, it's really not for them to worry about. They can choose to live as they want to live, but they shouldn't have the right to tell their neighbor what they can do. Just like you can't tell your neighbor what to think, what church to go to, their First Amendment rights. When it comes to their property rights, you shouldn't be able to tell your neighbors what they can do either. Leave that up to the average American to choose where they want to live. And in fact, in many states, we have seen, and I think even in California, we have seen some relaxation of that density fear and recognition that density is not a bad thing. But look at what it solves. The fact that we have less density and we make it hard to build housing in the inner, say, communities, and means we have to build housing somewhere, which means we build it further out. And so what does that do? It increases commute times. It makes it very expensive to get into the community where you need the jobs, where they need the teachers, for example, in the cities, if they're not going to allow density. It certainly increases the environmental impact because if we have people having to commute long ways, and we certainly know that in LA and San Francisco and other major cities in California, we're creating more auto pollution. Whereas if we allowed more density, it may not be what, some Americans want and some Californians want, but if we allowed more density and just increased the amount of housing by allowing for much denser communities, we would see the housing prices come down. And I would posit that the homeowners who think they don't want density would be happier about it because they'd have less people homeless, less people squatting, less trouble. Everyone would have more money to invest in secondary effects, secondary pieces of the economy. Rising tide lifts all boats. And if we can get more Californians into affordable housing, again, not affordable because the government mandates it, because that doesn't really work, as we said earlier, but rather affordable because the free market is allowed to go to work by cutting the red tape and allowing builders and developers to build more housing.
If you haven't checked out CaliforniaInsider.com, we highly recommend you do that now because we're going to have a lot of news and videos there. And on top of what we have there right now, we are building a really big platform to cover what's happening in California so you can be informed. We're going to have more shows, more videos from all aspects of life in California. Go to CaliforniaInsider.com and we'll see you there.